Most readers have a few genres that they are drawn to, and a few that they typically stay away from. For me, the first genre of literature that I ever really fell in love with was fantasy and science fiction. Mostly fantasy. That said, I haven't read that much YA fantasy, and I guess that's because when I really got into fantasy, I was no longer a YA. I was an A. So I never felt like it was really for me. Even though I had friends and ex-partners who loved YA fantasy and would often tell me to read it, and I just didn't really. But then you get into what is YA? How do we define YA fantasy? And that's one of the questions that I went into this book asking and trying to find an answer to. And I think I did, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. It is difficult to define YA. A good example is Joe Abercrombie. I am a big fan of the books of Joe Abercrombie. I started off with The Blade itself, his first book. I read that whole trilogy. And then I moved into this Viking-inspired trilogy that he wrote that starts with Half a King, Half the World, Half a War. I think that's what they're called. And those books were kind of designated YA, and only because they seem to have a lot less gore, sex, violence, swearing, but they're still his books, and he's still a fantastic fantasy writer. So that just seemed like a kind of loose thing. And if people specialize in YA, oh, there's something in my mouth. It's difficult to pin down exactly what differentiates fantasy and YA fantasy. And there are a lot of readers out there who think fantasy as a genre is juvenile anyway, and would probably say, well, all fantasy is YA really. Never mind how well written the characters are, how allegorical or political it might be. That doesn't matter to those people. They don't like fantasy, so all of it's immature. As a fantasy reader who has now read a truly YA fantasy novel, I think I have an understanding. Anyway, all of this is kind of beside the point. I just read Strange the Dreamer. I know it's one half of a duology and I haven't read the second one yet. You can see it behind me. I will get to it. But books should be judged on their own merits, and that's what I'm going to do. So what do I think of it? Well, first off, what's it about? Strange the Dreamer tells the story of the titular Laszlo Strange. It's set in a fantasy world. No specifics about it, really. We'll come to that. And Laszlo Strange is a war orphan, and he starts off being raised in an orphanage by some monks, and then he ends up working and living at this big, giant library. It's basically a city-sized library, this giant place full of books. And there's this asshole who he doesn't like. You know, he's a rich kid, and he's a very... what's his name? Can't remember his name. The blonde one from Harry Potter. I don't like Harry Potter. I can't remember. The blonde one. He's like the blonde one. And Laszlo's like the title one, Harry Potter. There's this city. There's this city that's just called Weep. And Weep is the name that was given to the city after the real name of the city was magically stolen from the minds of everyone in the world. And so Weep has become this strange Shangri-La kind of place that Laszlo is desperate to go to. He's called Strange the Dreamer because he loves books and fairy tales and stories, and he's always in his head. He's always somewhere else. He's a dreamer, and he's a librarian, and so of course he's always reading these books. One day, the queen of whatever country they live in comes to the library with this delegation, and there's a person from Weep, this magic Shangri-La city. He's there. His name's Errol Fane, and he comes to the library, and he wants to gather up a bunch of people with different skills and build a party of people to return to Weep to solve a problem. And Laszlo is not going to get picked because he's just a librarian, he's nothing special. In the end, he does get picked because he talks to them in their language, which he's been studying through books for his entire life because he loves that city and he's obsessed with its culture. So he shouts out, "No, please don't leave, take me with you, I speak your language, etc. I'll be your secretary." And so he literally is this guy's secretary, whatever that means. And then that's it. They go on a journey to Weep, and eventually they get there. This isn't spoiling anything, by the way. This is all pretty early on in the book. The first act of the book runs at a really, really quick pace. So they get to Weep, and it turns out there's this giant tower. I pictured it like the Jesus statue at Rio de Janeiro. It's this giant statue of like an angel, and its wings cover the whole city, and they want to just blow it up or get rid of it because it blocks the sunlight. And then you find out, and again, I'm still not really spoiling anything here, there is a whole second protagonist who is this girl who's half a god, and she lives with a bunch of other half gods up in the sky, and they survived this, I think it's called the Carnage, this thing where all the gods got wiped out. The gods seem to have been bad people, and these are their children, and they're left. It's kind of like when Anakin kills all the younglings, and Cal Kestis in Jedi Fallen Order is a survivor of that. If anyone's played Jedi Fallen Order, that's it. That's as much as I'm going to tell you. They get to weep, and then the story goes from there, and then the story really begins. So that's all I'll tell you. I have written down 11 thoughts about this book, and I'm going to run through them and tell you what I think. Most of the thoughts that I have a pro and a con. There's a good side to that thought and a bad side. Sometimes it's just bad. Stick with me. Okay, my first thought is actually a criticism of a criticism. At the front of the book, there's a whole page of positive criticisms from different magazines and stuff. And one of them is from Kirkus Reviews, and Kirkus is big. And the person who wrote this said, "Lovers of intricate world building and feverish romance will find this enthralling." I disagree with both of those things. There isn't much world building. There is and there isn't much world building. And I can't talk about the romance. It's very obvious there's going to be romance. It's a YA fantasy novel. Most fantasy has some romance in it. And this has a lot of romance, but not until like at least the second half is there any romance. So I'm not going to talk about it. But the romance isn't very compelling. I didn't believe it. You've got your protagonist, you know they're going to fall in love with someone. The someone that they fall in love with is fine, and they fall in love because they fall in love. I didn't really feel much. I wouldn't say it was compelling in any way. As for the world building, I have an interesting take on this, or at least I think it's interesting. Strange the Dreamer is set in some fantasy place, and Weep is this legendary city that they want to go to. I thought at first, based on the fact that Laszlo is a real Earth name, and no one else has a real Earth name, we'll come to that, I thought that it was actually going to be set on Earth. I thought it was going to be like Indiana Jones or the Uncharted games, where you go off on an adventure with Laszlo to find a city in Antarctica or the Amazon or something. It's not the case. It's a fantasy world. What I really, really dislike most about Strange the Dreamer is that it implies that the world that you start in, the world that Laszlo is born into, there's nothing worth knowing about it. We know nothing about the politics. There's a queen. Don't even remember her name. Don't know anything about her. Don't know the state of the world. I don't know its history, its architecture, its religion, its politics. He was a war orphan. Don't know what the war was. None of it matters. What matters is this one magical city that exists somewhere that Laszlo wants to get to. Weep. Nothing else matters. So it's good world building because Weep is interesting. Weep the city, when they get there, is a really interesting place. So this is the pro. Weep is great. Very interesting place. The big statue, the history of there being gods and the children of gods up in the sky, all that's really interesting, and it does build and build and build, so that is good world building. But why set it in a fantasy world if only this one magic city is worth knowing about? Why put us in a fantastical world if only one aspect of that world is any use to us or is any interesting? Why not put it on Earth and have there be somewhere a strange magical Shangri-La place for us to explore and go to? I think that would have been more interesting. But it's not. You just have to assume that the country, city, place that Laszlo was born and raised in is dull as shit and not worth knowing about. I find that really bizarre. Yeah, that's my one really big criticism, is that this is not good world building. At least not as a world. It's good city building. Weep is good. The world doesn't need to exist. And this brings me on to the other thing about politics, and it also brings me on to what I think kind of seems to define YA fantasy over regular fantasy is the politics. A lot of fantasy novels are very, very political. I think the best example is A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. Politics is everything in that series. It is all about international relations, it is all about religion, it is all about really, really deep political themes like racism and slavery, like misogyny, like the role of the church, separation of church and state, war, political subterfuge, and patriarchy, and royalism. It's all there. Game of Thrones is so intensely political. In fact, the politics is really all that matters. The characters are just a vehicle for the politics. And it's inspired by a lot of political historical events like the War of the Roses. And a lot of other fantasy books are intensely political as well. As I said, Joe Abercrombie's books, Robin Hobb's books. Strange the Dreamer lacks politics entirely. And perhaps that is one of the things that kind of defines YA fantasy, is it's not too political, it's not too wrapped up in war and international politics within the world that it's set in. Maybe that's one thing that kind of defines it. But that means that for me it was a little bit less interesting than it could have been. But the bigger problem is that without politics, without war, without understanding how each city, country, state, whatever operates, the laws, the rules, the religion, the lore, I have to be careful how I pronounce that, laws and lore, L-O-R-E, lore. Without all of that, there is no world building. And what you're left with is a feeling that only Laszlo and the other characters that surround him, his party, they're the only people that exist. When you get to Weep, there's only like 3 people in the city, as far as I can tell. And Laszlo grows up in a library. As far as I know, his entire world is a library. There is nothing else around him. There's a monastery and then a library. There's no world. They cross a big desert for the entire journey between wherever Laszlo is from and Weep. They just go through a big empty desert. There's nothing in this world, so it's not just the lack of politics, it's a lack of people. There's no history, there's no geography, there's no architecture. I could not tell you anything about the fashion, the religion, the architecture, nothing. I don't know anything about how it looks, but we'll come to that. That's actually a separate thought. I've said that there are 11 thoughts, but I'm kind of merging them all together as I ramble on. I've written them down as 11, but they're merging. Something that's really, really good about the book is the prologue. There is an opening chapter in this book. I think it's called the prologue. Sometimes they call them different things. Yeah, prologue. So there's a prologue. It is 2 pages long, and it is beautiful. The language in this prologue is poetic. It's flowery in a good way. It's delicious language. That's great. It drew me in. When Jess told me to read it, I read the prologue and I went, oh yeah, wow, this is incredible writing. The metaphors that are being used, the adjectives, the way it's described is delicious. It's like honey. Beautiful language. This does set up unreal expectations though, because if the language carries on being that beautiful all the way through, it'll be kind of exhausting. 2, it's probably not gonna keep going all the way through, so the language will progressively peter out and get less interesting as it goes. And that's actually kind of what happens. So, good and bad. It starts off really beautiful, not just the prologue, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and I get the feeling that this could have been because of submissions. Like, as an author, when you want to submit a manuscript, you usually submit the first 3 chapters / 5,000 words. I know I've done it like 50 times. No, I'm not a published author. You make that language in those chapters as beautiful as possible. And then, as it goes, you find your flow and you start writing more normally. Less flowery, for one reason or another. It's not really a bad thing, but you do notice that the style changes. So the flowery language peters out as it goes. It's not really a good or a bad thing. The flowery language would be too much if it was all the way through. It's a little bit of a shame that it isn't, but it would have been exhausting. So not really good or bad, just an observation, that one. Another problem, but it's also sometimes not a problem, is that Laszlo isn't a very interesting protagonist. I don't think I could describe his personality, except the fact that he's a dreamer. I understand his position in society to a point, although I don't really know anything about the class system because it's not explored. He's just, a guy with his head in the clouds. And all the way through, I'm still not sure what his use is, because I thought, oh, he speaks the language of Weep, he'll be an interpreter. He's not an interpreter. And so I don't really know what he's for. And then at the end, at the very, very end, there is an enormous twist that obviously encourages you to read the sequel. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but there is a twist. I figured there would be because there's a sequel and you want to leave it on a big cliffhanger. So there's a big twist. And I found that twist, it is about Laszlo. It doesn't make him a more interesting character. And it was very, very, very awkwardly written. It made me curl up a little bit. It made my toes curl. I didn't like it. So, yeah, Laszlo's just not very interesting. But a lot of protagonists aren't. A lot of protagonists are not very interesting people. To mention Game of Thrones again, Jon Snow's not a very interesting protagonist. Neil Gaiman, I've talked about him before in my videos. He always writes really boring protagonists because they're kind of audience surrogates, and so they're going to be uninteresting to a point. And Laszlo is very much an audience surrogate, especially the fact that he reads a lot of books, and people who read this book have probably read books, and so they go, oh, I'm like Laszlo, I'm a dreamer, I've got my head in the clouds, I love fairy tales, because you're reading a fucking fantasy book, so of course you're like Laszlo. He's very much the audience surrogate, and he's fine as that. The last thing, this is like 3 points all merged together. There are a lot of fantasy tropes in this. Now, I typically like fantasy tropes. I find that they're often camp and silly, and that's the case here. There's good and there's bad. One thing is names. Characters have all got ridiculous names, except for Laszlo. He has a recognizably Earth name because he's our protagonist and we need to know how to say it out loud. Everyone else, I've tried not to mention their names. Errol Fane, I don't know if that's actually how you say it. There's Sarai, don't know if I pronounced that right. And then there are names with a lot of X's in them, and no, I have no idea how to pronounce any of them. And it gets to the point that, you know, I read with a voice in my head. I have a very loud voice in my head that reads as I read, if that makes sense. Some people do this, some people don't. And if I don't know how to pronounce a name, I read it 100 times, pronouncing it in different ways in my brain voice. And I didn't know how to pronounce names, and it's kind of irritating. Minor gripe, but a gripe nonetheless. And one big fantasy trope in this is people are a little bit different to how humans are in the real world. Everyone has two hearts, and it's explained at the beginning. I actually thought it was a metaphor, and I thought it was a really beautiful metaphor. There's a bit where it says about how he has one heart that pumps blood, and the other pumps something called spirit. And I thought it was a metaphor. It read like a metaphor, and I remember thinking, wow, if I'd read this when I was younger, I would have thought it was being literal. I wouldn't have got the metaphor. And it is being literal, there is no metaphor. It's people have two hearts. And I thought, okay, so there's magic in this world. And maybe it's like mana in a video game where you've got your health and you've got your mana, your MP. One heart pumps blood and the other pumps mana. No, that's not what it is. It's not really anything. It's put in there because you need something unusual, and it's referenced all the way through, you know. Characters will say, I feel it in my hearts, or whatever. That's it, really. Hearts. That's your lot. There's also no central antagonist in this book. Now, Jess has read the sequel and said that there is an antagonist in the sequel. There's not really an antagonist in this one. There was a thing that happened, as I mentioned, this carnage, I think it's called. The thing that happened where the people of Weep killed the gods, and the gods were bad, and now there's problems brewing. There is a problem that needs to be solved. I won't go into it. But there's no antagonist. I actually think that's a really cool thing. Having a fantasy book without a central antagonist, whether that be an enemy nation or a politician or an evil queen or whatever, there isn't really that. And that's refreshing. Also means that the book is a bit meandering and it lacks a bit of agency and a bit of oomph to get it going. So that one's a double-edged sword for sure. Oh, and the other thing, one last thing is the side characters. When Laszlo leaves to go to Weep, he goes with a big party. And on the journey through the desert, he gets to know a lot of them. And there's obviously the childhood asshole who goes on the journey. And the two of them, you know, butt heads a lot. And there's a girl who's like a thief and she climbs things. And he bonds with these people, or doesn't. But, you know, there's friction between them. There is something going on. And then when they get to Weep, these side characters are pretty much dropped and replaced by new side characters. And I was just kind of a shame. You know, I bonded with them, then they were gone. That's it. So I've come away from this pretty negative, but I did also really enjoy it. And I don't expect you to believe me when I say I enjoyed it, because I certainly didn't sound like I did. But I did. I had fun reading this. It was a fun fantasy romp. It's inoffensive. It's very beautifully written for the most part. And, you know, it's silly and it's corny, but I knew that it would be. And I thought I would still have some fun with it. And I did. I really did have fun. I don't know when I'll get to the sequel. You know, Jess loved it and she tore through it and then she jumped into the sequel immediately. I'll get to it. But, you know, it's fine. It was fine. Just had a lot of questions and comments and issues, hence the video. So there you go. Strange the Dreamer. It's all right. Subscribe for books.